I can't help but laugh when I think about the time I decided I was going to be a stand-up comedian. I was young, full of this wild, naive confidence, thinking that all it took to make people laugh was the right mix of timing, delivery, and a good sense of humor. Of course, I learned the hard way that it's not as simple as telling a few funny stories and hoping the crowd buys it. But let me tell you, I thought I had it all figured out. I thought I was destined to be the next big thing. I was in my early 20s, and if you could have seen me back then, you would have seen a guy who had no idea what he was getting into. At that age, I had no real career ambitions, no clear direction. I was floating through life like most people at that age, unfocused, a little bit lost, trying to figure out what I was supposed to do with myself. But one thing I knew for sure, I was funny, or at least I thought I was. And isn't that the first step? Thinking you're funny? Because it's a slippery slope from there to thinking you could be a comedian. I wasn't just telling jokes at parties anymore. I wasn't just cracking wise with friends at the bar. No, I had bigger dreams now. The dream was to be on stage, under the lights, making people laugh for a living. I'd been to a few open mics, watched comedians work the crowd, and I saw how they had control over the room, how they could make the audience laugh, gasp, or sit in stunned silence, all within the span of a few minutes. I remember sitting in the back of those dives, nursing a cheap beer, thinking, this is it. This is what I'm going to do. I had this image of myself, standing on stage, with the crowd hanging on my every word. I could already hear the laughter in my head. I was going to be good at it. I could feel it. The first time I stepped on stage for an open mic, I had no idea what I was doing. None at all. I'd written a few bits down, but really, they were just some half-formed ideas and observations. Some humorous things I'd thought about in passing. I thought I had to write material, real material, like the guys I'd seen. So, I jotted down a few lines that felt sharp, edgy. Funny enough for a laugh, right? Wrong. I remember pacing in the back of the bar, my palms sweating, my heart thumping in my chest like I'd just run a marathon. I wanted to throw up. I wanted to back out. I'd heard people say it before. The hardest part is getting on stage for the first time. It's like your whole body rebels against it. It's the fear of public speaking, of failing in front of a room full of strangers who are all waiting for you to fall flat on your face. I didn't know that was what I was afraid of. I thought I was afraid of bombing, but it was deeper than that. It was fear of realizing that the joke in my head wasn't going to land. Fear that I wasn't as funny as I thought. When the host called my name, I stumbled up to the mic like a guy who had no business being there. I remember adjusting the mic stand, trying to look casual, but my hands were shaking. I tried to smile, to look confident, but I felt like I was suffocating. The room was dim, filled with smoke and the low hum of murmurs from the crowd. But when I grabbed that mic, everything fell silent. All the eyes were on me, and for the first time I realized how terrifying that was. I opened with a joke that I thought was gold. Something about the absurdity of modern technology, how we're all slaves to our phones, always glued to them. Simple enough, right? Maybe a little cliché, but I thought I could sell it. I delivered it with the kind of enthusiasm I thought you needed, like I was in character, like I was already a comedian, a professional. But the room didn't respond the way I thought they would. There wasn't even a polite chuckle. It was just dead air. I laughed nervously, trying to cover the awkwardness, but the more I tried, the worse it got. I moved on to the next bit, something about my failed attempts at dating, how the whole process felt like an interview but with no promise of a job at the end. You know, relatable stuff. Again, I thought it would land, but it didn't. Not even a flinch. The only sound was the rattle of a glass clinking in the back, a cough, maybe someone shifting in their seat. There was no applause. There wasn't even any groaning. It was just this suffocating silence that hung in the air like a thick, wet blanket. I told myself to keep going, to push through it. But it's hard to keep your momentum when you're getting nothing in return. I think I told another joke, something about how I hated the gym and the strange people you meet there. But it didn't matter. The crowd wasn't with me. It was as if the energy had been sucked out of the room. and no matter how hard I tried to keep talking, it was like I was invisible. By the time I got to my final bit, some half-baked, self-deprecating punchline about how I was just a guy trying to figure out life and hoping that I didn't completely mess it up, no one laughed. No one even reacted. The silence was deafening. I stood there for a second too long. I looked at the crowd, at their bored, detached faces. I could feel the sweat running down the back of my neck, my shirt sticking to my skin. I wanted to just drop the mic and walk off, but I didn't have the guts. So I awkwardly finished up my set, forced a half smile, and mumbled something about how I'd probably be back next week before stumbling off the stage like a man who had just been publicly humiliated. I remember the car ride home, the thoughts spinning in my head, going back over every word I'd said, every misstep, every moment of awkwardness. It wasn't just that I bombed. It was that I didn't even understand why I bombed. I couldn't see what had gone wrong. I couldn't see what the audience saw, and I couldn't put my finger on what was missing from my performance. I thought I had the jokes. I thought I had the material. But what I didn't have was experience. I didn't have the timing. I didn't have the awareness to read the room. The next few times weren't much better. I kept going back to the open mics, convinced that it was just about getting the hang of it. But the truth was, I wasn't getting it. I wasn't learning. I wasn't improving. I was just repeating the same mistakes, trying to squeeze laughs out of dry material, stumbling over my words and relying on nervous energy instead of genuine humor. I thought that if I just kept at it, I would eventually find the magic. But I wasn't really putting in the work to develop my craft. I was too busy being in love with the idea of being a comedian, without actually understanding what it meant to be one. The more I went to open mics, the more I saw the difference between me and the other comedians. The guys who had real stage presence, who could hold a room with just a look or a pause. They weren't just telling jokes, they were performing. They knew how to engage with the crowd, how to play off of their reactions, how to turn a bad situation into something funny. They weren't afraid of bombing. They understood that bombing was part of the process, that failure wasn't the end of the road. They knew how to pick themselves up and come back stronger. I didn't have that resilience. I didn't have that understanding. At some point I realized I wasn't cut out for it. It wasn't just that I wasn't funny enough. It was that I wasn't built for comedy. I had a sense of humor, sure. I could tell jokes and people would laugh at them, but that wasn't enough. I wasn't doing the work. I wasn't evolving. I wasn't pushing myself to grow. I wanted the spotlight, but I didn't want the struggle that came with it. I quit. Not with any fanfare, no grand declaration. I just stopped showing up. I stopped writing material. I stopped going to open mics. I let the dream slip away, quietly, without even realizing how much I'd been clinging to it. I laugh at that version of myself now. The one who thought all it took was a couple of good lines and some stage time. I laugh at how I was so sure that I could just waltz into comedy, like it was some natural extension of who I was, when really, it was something much more difficult, something much more complex. And I laugh because in the end, the whole thing was a lot harder than I could have imagined. But you know what? I'm glad I tried, even if I failed, even if I wasn't ready. Because now, when I see a comedian on stage, I know what it takes to make those laughs happen. And even though I never made it, I respect the hell out of those who did.